Welcome to class PM. Right from class 7, 8 and 6, we have been learning that there are different living organisms on our earth crust, right? And we also have learned that these organisms are classified based on the function of the cell, like say unicellular and multicellular organisms. Right, then you know that there are different living organisms which exist as one single cell or which possess multiple cells. Now, have you ever thought, like, we know that more or less these resemble each other, right? More or less they are similar to each other. But have you ever thought, like, do they look similar in every aspect? Let me give you an example. If I say, just take an example of yourself and your friend. Say, look at the nose of your friend and yours. Are they similar? No. You might have a very broad nose and your friend might have a very sharp nose. And look at your hand span, right? You may have a very shorter hand span, whereas your friend may have a long hand span, right? So when you look at these similarities, though you are commonly called as human being, you have differences in between, right? In between you and your friend. So we know that as there are many or different forms of living organisms present on the earth crust, where we can see a single cell bacteria which measures only few centimeters. But whereas there are few plants like which live for thousands of years, and there are few trees which measure like 50 meters to 100 meters long, right? So there are different things. You can see differences between the own species or between the same kind of organisms. So when you look at all these things, you see there are also different colored flowers, and sometimes you see there are transparent to colorless or colorful insects too, right? So as you keep observing, you might be seeing that though there are different varieties of different forms of living organisms, or you can say like if you take a group of insects, there are so many varieties of insects which you have not seen almost, right? You might have seen only few of the insects, right? So they all belong to the same family called insect family, but they differ a lot, So we have seen that there is a difference, huge difference, or you can say a small difference between the various organisms on the earth crust. So this is what you are going to learn, that is the diversity in living organisms. So the chapter we are going to do is the diversity in living organisms. So now, as I have told you, like when you look at the similarities and differences between you and your friend, though both of us belong to human species, or though both of you belong to the human species, there are lot many differences between you and your friend, right? So in same case, let us see what was the actual basis for classification. Now let us see what actually formed the basis of classification. I told you there are different forms of organisms. There are different forms in which life occurs, right? So there are different varieties of organisms which are present on the earth crust. So now what has led to the classification of these organisms, right? If I speak about this, I think classification of organisms was since immemorial time. That means none of us know, there is no exact day or exact time to say that this was the time when the classification of these organisms was done. So it is actually dated long back, okay? A Greek thinker, a philosopher called Aristotle, Greek philosopher. So as I've told you, what was the basis for the classification? As I've told, since time immemorial, we have known that we haven't known like when was the classification done. But according to the theory, what we have learned is a Greek philosopher or a thinker who is said to be Aristotle. He belonged to the period 384 to 322 BC. He was the one who actually classified animals based on whether they live on land or in water or fly in air. So what were the three basic things on which he has classified? Live on land, water, or fly in air. So this misled many of the many of the thinkers or many of the biologists to work with the classification. It was too difficult. It could easily mislead, right? See, you might have many animals which are present on the land, like terrestrial animals, right? You cannot classify all the terrestrial animals into one group, right? In the same way, you might have different varieties of aquatic animals like which live in water, say like whales, fish, shark, dolphins, so many. But Do you think that all these will have the same characteristic features? Definitely not. So actually this Aristotle's theory of classification was misled. Okay, and there was no proper evidence which was being accepted by other biologists giving this classification, which was being given by Aristotle. So this was the only basis which held blindly, where the Aristotle just classified the organisms, animals which lived on land, water and fly in air. So this actually, as I've told you, this couldn't work out. This couldn't work out. So therefore they have decided that while classifying, they have to consider the characteristics of an organism before the classification of the organism is done. That means the organisms are classified on the basis of the characteristics. It is not on the basis on their habitat. See, this is purely about the habitat, right? So landform is a habitat, water is a habitat, and air is also one of the habitat where you can see the animals living. But this gradually was not accepted, and then later on many biologists have come up with many suggestions saying that classification should be done on the basis of the characteristic features of an organism. It is not that you can just divide them based on where they live. So that led to the broadest division of the organisms into various groups. Broadest division of organisms into various groups. So mostly nowadays when you look at these organisms, you can say these organisms are usually classified into two types, like eukaryotes and prokaryotes. You have learnt in previous classes, the class 8 and everywhere, where you have learned that these eukaryotes are the cell membrane bound organelles. Eukaryotes have cell membrane. So nowadays when you relate to the classification, we see that organisms are categorized as eukaryotes and prokaryotes. So when you talk about these eukaryotic cells, we know that eukaryotic cells have membrane bound organelles with a distinct nucleus. And this demarcated nucleus which is present will help the cell to carry out the life processes, right? So in the same way, when you talk about prokaryotes, we know that these prokaryotes deny or devoid of these membrane bound organelles, and you know that there is a one single cell which will carry out the processes of life, right? So that means they are all unicellular almost, right? So we have been classified in such a way to understand that this group of organisms belong to eukaryotes and these group of organisms belong to prokaryotes. And what is that you have observed in classifying, while classifying these organisms? You have observed the characteristic feature which could be of a particular function or a particular feature, right? So when you are classifying the eukaryotes, we generally see that all these eukaryotes will have membrane bound cell organelles, right? And these cell organelles efficiently help them to carry out cell activities. In the same way, we can also say that this nucleus which is present will help in the process of cell division. So that means all the organisms which are falling under this eukaryotes will definitely undergo all these functions, right? And when you talk about the prokaryotes, you see that these prokaryotes are devoid of membrane bound organelles, like they do not have nuclear membrane over the nucleus, right? And these are actually called as primitive organisms. So that means all these organisms which are devoid of membrane around the nucleus are categorized as prokaryotes. So this is how, based on a characteristic feature, say it could be a function, say it could be a feature of the body, they have classified the organisms. And later on, you have seen that these plants, they have also classified they also have classified the organisms like eukaryotes and prokaryotes, say like the ones which can undergo the process of photosynthesis, right? You know, like what are those organisms which can synthesize food and which organisms cannot synthesize food. So these were the basic differences which were being sorted out to say, like, to classify the organisms, and we know that animals have specialized cells to carry out various cell activities, and plants do have pigments so that they can synthesize their food. So these are the different aspects on when a biologist looks at the classification, these were the different aspects he could come with. So the characteristic of body design. Say this body design also formed one of the characteristic feature in classification of organisms. When you look at the plants, they definitely have a different body design. And when you look at animals, different animals have different body design. It is not that both cat and rat will have the same body design. right? Or both lion and elephant have the same body design. Is that so? No. The number of cells in both the organisms vary. The structure of the body design of both the organisms will definitely vary, right? And when we look at ourselves and a monkey, there is a huge variation in case of body design, right? So that is what this also, the body design also has formed one of the basis for the classification of organisms. So as I've told you, this body design also is one of the characteristic feature which helped in the classification of organisms. Now, how is this classification related to evolution? We know that from a unicellular organisms, the multicellular organisms had evolved out. So we see that this gradually due to the evolution, as the evolution progressed, slowly you can see the unicellular organisms, like development of these into multicellular organisms, where you see that there are various animals, okay, which are categorized based on their body design. At the same time, the functions which are carried out by the cells in their body. So that means you have seen that the basic thing for the classification was, as the evolution progressed, the principle which was involved for classification was mainly based on two things, that was the body design and function. Body design and the function. And you see that there were so many changes which took place after the evolution of unicellular organisms, or you can say after the evolution of organisms. So there were so many changes which occurred throughout the body, which led to a different design in case of various organisms, and this helped us to understand the classification of organisms, or you can say this has formed the basis for the classification of organisms. So when you're talking about these classification and all, let me tell you what is classification. Let us write the definition for classification. So when you look at the definition of the classification, classification may be defined as a system of arrangement of organisms into different groups and subgroups on the basis of their similarities, differences and relationship. See, as I've told you, there are huge number of organisms present around us, right? So this largest group, there are the division of organisms is done in such a way that all the organisms in a large group form a largest group. Then based on their body design and functions, they are divided into a smaller group, then into a smaller group. So this is how they have arranged or assigned the classification of organisms into various groups. So whatever may be the classification is mainly based between the differences, similarities and relationship of the organism with the other. So this was actually brought in by Aristotle. As I've told you, he could only classify the animals based on three basic things, that is whether they live on land, live in water or fly in air. So this was actually mislead. So these attempts were not being accepted, and there were few drawbacks. Okay, not few drawbacks, almost it is a drawback, because this was not accepted worldwide, right? So now when we talk about the classification, we should know what is the importance of classification. Why should an organism should be classified? See, we all have families, right? You see, when you look at your family, you might have a very huge family. And when I ask you to draw a family tree, definitely you'll draw a very huge family tree with your cousins, with your family members, say like all your cousins of your father and all cousins of your mother. So paternal side and maternal side. So you will form a huge family group, right? So as we do have families, in the same way animals are also categorized based on their similarities, differences between each organism, and at the same time the relation of one organism to the other. So when we talk about the importance, what is the importance of classification? Then the first is to study a wide variety of organisms in a convenient and easy way. So what is the first important thing or first importance of classification? To study a wide variety of organisms in a convenient and easy way, in a very convenient and easy way. And then we know that it is not possible for us to remember every organism, right? Know about all the organisms, right? So you may see when I give you example of a cat and a lion, both of them look similar, but do you think they belong to same family? What do you say? So it is not possible to know about every organism, and it is not possible to remember about every organism and its characteristics. So this classification will help us to understand in a better way, and it makes us understand the characteristic features belonging to a particular family. And it will also help in revealing the interrelationship between various groups of organisms. There are various groups of organisms which are present in the earth crust, right? So there is a relationship between one and the other. So these interrelationships can be understood easily by the process of classification. So, and another important thing you need to know is identification of animals or plants will become utmost easy. So by seeing the family or by seeing the classification, you can easily identify these organisms. When I talk about this system of classification, it is hugely based on the similarities between the organisms, differences between the organisms, and their relationship with the other organisms. Do you know what is the study branch of science? Do you know what is the branch of science which is dealing with identification and the classification of these organisms called? Yes, I'll tell you, this is called as taxonomy. What is it called? Taxonomy. So, as I've told you, this branch of science dealing with the identification of organisms, nomenclature in the sense naming the organism. See, generally when you have a new child in your home, definitely you'll have a naming ceremony, right? So, in case of plants and animals, we cannot carry out this naming ceremony, right? So the names are being provided or given by the scientist or biologist. So that is said to be nomenclature. And classification of organisms So a branch which deals with identification, nomenclature and classification is said to be taxonomy. And the father of taxonomy is none other but Carolus Linnaeus. Carolus Linnaeus is father of taxonomy. He is a Swedish scientist. Is father of taxonomy. And he is the person who actually gave an appropriate method of classification, that is binomial nomenclature. Now, when you talk about this nomenclature, let us know how actually the classification or hierarchy of classification is done. So, let us look at hierarchy of classification. So, when I just get back to the same basic which I have told you, that the classification is usually done on the basis of body, design and its function. So there is a hierarchy. As I've told you, the large number of organisms are grouped into a larger group, then they are divided into a subgroup, and then the smaller group is again divided into another group. So there are so many groups in a family which make up a family during the classification. So when you look at the hierarchy of classification, you can just see, so two biologists called Ernest Haeckel and Robert Whittaker. So as I've told you, let us look at the hierarchy of classification. So this hierarchy of classification is in the sense grouping the organisms into various levels, saying kingdoms. So these were the two scientists or biologists who actually worked with the classification of organisms into broad kingdoms or broader groups said to be kingdoms. Ernest Haeckel and Robert Whittaker. So they started giving the classification and classified the organisms into different groups called as kingdoms. See, in social, we generally know that Mughal kingdom, or we learn it as Chola kingdom, or some other kingdoms, right? So in the same, that means that belongs to a complete Chola family, or say Mughal family, or Nizam's kingdom, right? Nizam family, right? In the same way, the organisms, the group of organisms which were categorized into one particular family were being given the names as kingdoms. And this was proposed by two scientists called Ernest Haeckel and Robert Whittaker. So they have broadly classified the organisms into 5 different kingdoms. And you know what was the hierarchy which was given by them to name? Yes. This is how the hierarchy starts. Kingdom or phylum. Phylum is in case of plants we generally call. Phylum for animals. So the classification, the hierarchy of classification was somewhat given like this. The kingdom, okay, phylum. So in case of animals, when we write animal family, we mention it as phylum. Division in case of plants. So then class, to which class do they belong? Order, family, genus and species. So let us learn about this each in detail. And you know, the species which is present, it is the lowest category, and it is the basic unit of classification. So when you look at the hierarchy, so as I've told you, this is how the hierarchy of classification is done. So the kingdom which is present, it forms the highest category of classification, where you'll have you can say that you have a division of phylum for animals and division for in case of plants. So when you look at the class, a class is nothing but a group of related orders. An order is group of related family members. A family will represent a larger group of various genus, and species is the lowest category which forms the basic unit, So this two kingdom classification was given by Carolus Linnaeus, and you know, every organism is named with two names, like genus name and species name. So as we are talking about the hierarchy, I have given you the hierarchy of classification. Let me give you one example so that you can understand it better. We all know coriander. That is nothing but your coriander, which you add in your vegetables, curries, right? You generally, when you look at some cookery shows, they say that finally garnish with coriander, right? So this coriander is actually used to flavor the food, and this belongs to a kingdom called Plantae. And we know that in case of plants, we don't call it as phylum, we call it as division of plants. And the division of plants is Tracheophyta, and the class is Magnoleopsida, and the order of this kingdom is Apiales, and family is Apiaceae, genus is Coriander, and species is Sativum. See, in coriander also you find varieties of coriander, right? So the species is the one where you can see the lowest category but the basic unit for classification. There are different species. So I can give you a few examples for this scientific names. When you talk about rose, you name it as Rosa indica. The scientific name is Rosa indica. We know apple. When you write the scientific name, you write as Pyrus malus. And we all eat rice, right? This rice is written as Oryza sativa. And say like grapes, Vitis vinifera. When you talk about buffalo, we all know that we get the dairy products from these buffalo, right? It is Bos bubalis. And owl, it is nothing but bubo. And as during rainy season, we see many frogs, croaking sound of frogs, right? Frog is Rana tigerina. So these are the various scientific names which are being given by the biologists. So when you look at all the scientific names, you see that every scientific name starts with a capital letter, and the genus, this is genus name and this is species name. So when you look at this genus and species name, the first letter of the genus starts with capital, and the species, in case of species, the first letter starts with small letter. So this is the rule to be followed when you write the taxonomical classification, right? The first letter of the genus should be capital, and the first letter of the species should be written in lowercase letter. It should be written in lowercase. So that is actually the rule to be followed when giving the taxonomical classification. So this is how you can see the hierarchy of classification is done. Actually, the basis has formed from Aristotle. Later on, various biologists started working on it, and they have come out with a good method of classification where we can easily identify and remember these organisms which were placed according to the body design and function of the body or function of the cell into various, you can say various groups like kingdom, phyla or division, class, order, family, genus and species. So whenever you look at this, all the organisms, all plants, all animals, everyone has a scientific name, even human. Alright, do you know what is human called as? Humans are called as Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens. We belong to a species called Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens. So this is all about how the hierarchy of classification was done, and because everywhere you observe that every organism, say it could be a plant or animal, are given two names as genus and species. As this two name classification is done, this classification is said to be binomial nomenclature. What is it called? This is said to be binomial nomenclature. Bi means two, nomial means two, name. Nomenclature is naming of organism, right? So this binomial nomenclature, this is said to be binomial nomenclature because every organism has two names such as genus and species. So this was successfully explained or brought into limelight by a Swedish scientist called Carl Linnaeus.